Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sara Lubratt and today's video is episode 3 of 5 of how to write a book in 2025. And today we are tackling writing the middle. The middle is often the hardest part for writers to get through, so today we're going to be talking about writer's block, imposter syndrome, and overall how to get through feeling stuck. A new episode of this series is coming out every Monday in January. There are 2 out already. If you have not seen those, you can check them out here. But assuming you're all caught up or you're stuck in the middle and you need some advice, let's get into it. If you go on to find this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a big thumbs up because it really supports my channel by telling the YouTube algorithm that you liked my video and that somebody else might too. And now, without further ado, let's start talking about how to get through the middle of your book. The first thing I want to touch on is that I feel like the middle of the book is where most writers tend to feel really slowed down. And I think that this can be viewed one of 2 ways, and often it's a combination of both, but either that is the story is just slowing down and you don't really know how to get to the end, or sometimes it is just not feeling like you're making enough progress because that word count isn't going up as much as it did when you started writing. And we're going to be talking a little bit about both of those things today. First things first, we're going to be talking about the mind tricks that we can play on ourselves. When you start writing a book, those first couple thousand words, I feel like often up to like 20,000 words feel like they fly by, or can feel like they fly by. And then sort of after 20 or 30,000 words, I personally start to feel bogged down a little bit just because it feels like that word count isn't making as much progress as I want it to feel like. And so I have 3 tips for this. The first tip is to open up a new document just to separate out your story a little bit so that you can still have that feeling of making progress by adding word count to a relatively short document instead of your overall manuscript document, assuming that's how you write. I wrote a very, very messy first draft for one of my books that was across 22 documents at one point, which I don't necessarily recommend doing, but sometimes it can be helpful if you're starting to feel bogged down or like you're not writing quickly enough to just open up a new document. If, like we talked about in episode 2, you get a little bit scared of the blank page, that is totally okay. That's totally normal. You can just copy and paste over a couple of sentences from the last time you wrote, just so that you're not staring at a blank page, and then you can start writing. Something about having something already on the page is wildly helpful, but that will help give you visual progress. Tip number 2 is also about visual progress, and that is also something that we talked about in episode 2, which is writing in different colors. This might not work for you, but this works really well for me, where every time I sit down to write, even throughout a day of writing where I sit down, we'll say 2 or 3 different times, I will write in different colors each of those times, just so that I can see the visual progress instead of what I'm writing today blending into what I wrote yesterday. And seeing that new color on the page gives your mind the ability to track that physical progress because you can see like a block of text or a couple paragraphs or a couple pages even in one color as opposed to the previous writing section's text color. My third tip for this is to track your progress. This is also something we talked about in episode 2, but I'm just trying to hammer this home about how important it is to see our physical progress, especially when writing on computers and we can't just see how many handwritten pages of a notebook or something we've done. When it's all scrolling, we kind of lose the ability to conceptualize that, which I guess you could zoom out really far in your document, but it just isn't the same thing. This is a little bit tangential, but sometimes it is really nice to be able to print out your work just to hold it physically and just remind yourself like, oh my gosh, I did this. When you get to the point of wanting to print out your story, which you can do at any point, especially if it would be beneficial for you in visualizing how much progress you've made, I highly recommend printing them single-sided, which yes is a waste of paper, recycle when you're done, but it's so much more satisfying to hold a thicker stack of paper. But back to tip number 3, having a visual tracking system, whether that's in a spreadsheet or some kind of tracking sheet that you've made on a piece of paper. I think I mentioned in the last video how I've seen some people either make or download from like Etsy or something a tracking sheet where they fill in a square or a circle every 1,000 words, every 5,000 words, every 10,000 words. It could honestly be every 50 words, 100 words, 500 words. Whatever it is you need that will help you realize that you are making progress is what you should do. So now that we've talked about some of those brain tricks, let's talk about things that you can actually focus on within your plot and the emotional beats in your story to get through the slower middle. And then we're going to talk about writer's block and imposter syndrome. I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I turned to Skillshare because of how many amazing creative writing classes they have. I thought that this would be the perfect partnership for this video if you are looking for more tips and advice. I've been wanting to learn more about how to sustain projects and get through the sticky middle, and with the classes and learning paths on Skillshare, it has been so easy to learn. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes, led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, creative writing, writing, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your passions, hobbies, or even career to the next level. I say this in a lot of my videos, but creativity is a muscle, and the more you exercise and build your craft, the more you can grow. And that applies to any creative discipline that excites you. What if this year is the year that we spend more time focusing on our creativity? And that's what Skillshare is here for. It's all about making the choice to learn, grow, and nurture a creative practice of your own. Flex into new skills on Skillshare and grow in all of the ways you've wanted to. That's why the class, Creative Productivity, Kickstart and Sustain Any Project, called to me so much. And I felt like was the perfect class to be mentioned within this video about taking consistent, efficient action on your personal or professional projects. From developing memorable fictional characters, to writing boot camps on starting a new story, to journaling challenges, and creative productivity, Skillshare is your one-stop shop for learning any new skill this year. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started with Skillshare today. I mentioned emotional beats a little bit in episode 1 of this series, but emotional beats refer to specific moments in the narratives where characters experience significant emotional shifts, which often propel the plot forward and drive their actions. So when you are feeling stuck or slogged down in the middle of writing your book, you can always check in with your characters and see where they would be at emotionally, see how you can mess with them a little bit. You can also refer back to those likability scales that we talked about, which are likability, proactivity, and competence, and see what they could be going through or how what they are going through could affect those likability scales. If the story is feeling slow, you can also try raising the stakes. And the stakes are something gained or lost in relation to the goal your character is pursuing. A few ways to raise the stakes in your story is to add something like a ticking clock. It does not actually have to be a ticking clock, but the easiest way to visualize this is that time is actively running out for your character to do something they really, really need to do. Maybe the character set out to do something and then suddenly they realize that they misinterpreted something and suddenly they have half the allotted time that they thought they had. Or your character is trying to get somewhere and they know that they have 2 minutes before the next round of guards comes by, or some possible ways to add a ticking clock to raise the stakes. Another great way to raise the stakes in your story is to evaluate the consequences of each choice that your character is faced with. It's also best if there's no perfect answer for your character, so that there's always some kind of consequence for the choices that they make. Stakes add conflict, and conflict is a great way to propel the plot and your story to the end. So we've looked a little bit at emotional beats, raising the stakes, and now I'm going to remind you guys of something that we talked about in an earlier episode of this series, which is promise, progress, and payoff. Like the likability scales, these are both things that I found in Brandon Sanderson's online free lectures. They are available here on YouTube. Highly recommend watching them. But the 3 P's, promise, progress, and payoff, are a great thing to focus on when you're feeling stuck in the middle of your story, because it's really easy to think of promise, progress, payoff as the overarching story, but in reality, there can be each of those 3 things at a chapter level, on a subplot level. There will constantly be new promises and progress and payoffs throughout the story, and giving those little payoffs leading up to the ending is what helps make a really satisfying ending. So if you are feeling bogged down in the middle of your story, I would recommend rereading your last couple of pages or your last couple of chapters and seeing where there was promise or progress, and if there wasn't any, I recommend adding some into the next chapter, maybe even adding in a little bit of a payoff or something that feels like a half payoff, like the character achieved what they were trying to achieve, but actually something changed, going back to the stakes, where they misunderstood what they were trying to accomplish, where they thought they were getting somewhere and then actually they need to get a little bit further. But the feeling of having payoff throughout the book is going to keep the reader reading. It's also important to remember your character's motivations. What does your character want? And how do your character's motivations help them see the world? And then through that, how does that affect the promise, what they're promising themselves, what they're promising others, what the story is promising the reader, how that promise is progressing, and how that progress is finally paying off. And like I said earlier, all of the mini payoffs throughout the book are building towards the ending. So now let's say that you're like, yeah, Sarah, that all sounds great, but I'm just not coming up with any ideas at all. I'm completely stuck. I'm having really serious writer's block. What do I do? There are a lot of different views on writer's block, and I used to experience writer's block rather frequently until I heard somebody say that writer's block is just your story telling you that you took the wrong turn. And then as soon as I heard that feedback, how I viewed writer's block has completely shifted, because now sometimes I just need to reread my last couple pages or my last couple chapters to figure out where it feels like the story went wrong, and then I might need to delete a couple pages which is fine, it's a rough draft, to then go in a different direction. Or sometimes rereading the last couple chapters then will kickstart some new ideas, and then maybe you can move forward with that. If that doesn't work, sometimes the simple act of switching away from your computer to handwriting for a little bit switches something in your brain for the ideas to start flowing again. A couple of my writing friends do something that they call pre-writing, which can help you come up with new ideas, it can help you organize your ideas, it can help you decide on how you're going to approach a scene or a chapter, or it may help you figure out how different pieces of your writing or your story may fit together. Pre-writing can include brainstorming, mapping, note-taking, writing down the gist of what you think is going to happen next, or maybe a couple of ideas of what could happen next. The goal of pre-writing is to get your mind working before you actually sit down to begin writing. Getting stuck in the middle is also part of why in episode 1 I recommended trying not to overplot or over-outline your story, because it's easy to become obsessed with the idea that you have on your outline instead of letting the story do what feels best. Because sometimes you don't know what's going to be best for the story until you actually sit down to begin writing. Or in this case, when you're halfway through your book and things just don't feel like they're clicking. If you're still feeling stuck with writer's block at this point in time, I have 3 other tips for you. One of them is to just go on a walk. If you go on a walk, don't put in your headphones, don't be looking down at your phone. Try to go walk for like 30 or 45 minutes. Your brain will get bored, and boredom is a beautiful thing because then your brain will sort of figure out that that time needs to be focused on working through your story because it has literally nothing else to do. Because you're not listening to a podcast or music, you're not filling that space with something else, and it has to be forced into boredom, and sometimes that's what works. The slightly less scary option to being left alone with your thoughts is to listen to music, whether you go for a drive or you go for a walk with music. I still recommend the boredom aspect, but sometimes you just need to get back into the vibe and the world in order for your story ideas to start flowing again. So maybe this means that you put on your writing playlist while you're driving. Maybe you need to scroll through Pinterest for a while and pin some new ideas to your storyboard. These are all great in concept. The only thing that I will warn against is that you can do too much of this and just procrastinate writing. So be careful that you're not just using it as an escapism thing to get away from doing the hard thing, which is sitting down to write. And tip number 3 is to talk through your story with a trusted friend. We talked in an earlier episode about having an accountability partner where you can have somebody that asks in on your writing and helps hold you accountable to the goals that you set out for yourself. But either having an accountability partner or a parent or a friend, I prefer a writing or a reading friend that you trust. That's a big one. And feel comfortable with, that's also a big one. To talk through your story and why and how you're feeling stuck. And sometimes it's the simple act of talking about your story out loud that makes the story click and you kind of figure it out as you're processing out loud. That's also something we do in my writing group, is sometimes when somebody's feeling stuck, they just talk about it for a few minutes. And oftentimes without anybody else saying anything or responding other than like, yeah, that sounds really interesting, or like asking 1 or 2 questions to clarify something, the person who's sharing is like, oh, I got it, and then like starts writing. So maybe you just need to talk about your story out loud, maybe you need to try handwriting, or maybe you need to try journaling about your story idea, which is just like another way of talking it through, but just with yourself. Or maybe you want to try the pre-writing and the brainstorming for each scene before you write. And it doesn't even need to be each scene, but if you're feeling stuck, maybe you try pre-writing for the next thing you want to write. This is also where I'm going to remind you guys that you don't have to write in any certain order. You don't need to write in chronological order. If you are feeling stuck in one part of your book, maybe you jump ahead to a scene that you are excited about or where you know what's going to happen, and then maybe working on that scene that's a little bit further ahead will help you figure out what needs to happen next where you got stuck. There's no right way to write a book. However writing works for you is what works for you, and that's all that matters. I've already mentioned writing sprints and productive breaks, but I'm going to recommend them again because especially when writing the middle, when we're a little bit less driven by inspiration and it's more about us showing up to our desks or our computers or our notebooks and doing the disciplined thing and sitting down and showing up for our writing, timed writing sprints might be your best friend at this point in the process. And then the beauty of sitting down for 20 or 30 minutes is that you know that that time span is going to end. So even if you only get a couple of sentences written, or even if you spend that time pre-writing or brainstorming for your next scene, you're not forcing yourself to sit down for hours at a time and then beating yourself up for not writing pages and pages and pages. There's a beautiful thing in showing up for a short short period of time and then standing up and doing a productive break, whether that's just walking around for a few minutes or doing your laundry or your dishes. Something easy and simple where your hands are moving but your brain still has the capacity to be thinking about your story without even you kind of realizing it, so that when you sit back down for your next writing sprint, you're ready to go. Now, everybody's favorite topic, imposter syndrome. First things first, I want to tell you that you are not alone if you have a negative voice in your head that's telling you something along the lines of, I'm not good enough for this, I'm not smart enough for this, I don't write well enough for this, it's not coming out perfectly and therefore I should not be writing this. When somebody is experiencing imposter syndrome, they often experience repeated feelings or thoughts that they are incompetent or not good enough, despite there often being evidence to the contrary. So some ways to start fighting that imposter syndrome when they come up is to start reframing those negative thoughts into neutral or positive thoughts. If you see a therapist, you can talk to them about it. Highly recommend therapy. I talk very openly about the fact that I'm in therapy. It's incredibly helpful for me. If you do not have access to therapy, you can talk to your trusted writing friend or your accountability partner about the fact that you're experiencing imposter syndrome, and they can help start to encourage you out of that feeling. And when that person compliments your writing or compliments your ideas, instead of downplaying them, just say, thank you. It's important to be able to accept positive feedback and acknowledge positive feedback instead of always downplaying our achievements. A couple other things that help with imposter syndrome is trying to focus on the growth mindset. We are all learning in this process. We are not going to be perfect on the first try. Some of the imposter syndrome is comparing our books to published novels, which have not only gone through a rough draft, which is the phase that you are probably in right now, but many edits, drafts, revisions, line editing, proofreading by the author, and then more developmental editing, line editing, proofreading by professionals, so other editors, agents, publishers, a full-on marketing team, etc. There's a quote that goes something along the lines of, comparing your rough draft to a fully polished and published novel is like comparing an acorn to an oak tree. So we have to return to, we are learning, we are growing, this is a rough draft. And going back to the quote on my writing motivation board that we've already touched on a couple times, is this quote by Shannon Hale that says, I'm writing a first draft and reminding myself that I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles. And this quote, which says, the first draft is as bad as the book is ever going to be. Comparison is the thief of joy, and so we have to embrace that positive, or at the very least, neutral self-talk, and celebrate our achievements and milestones, which is partially why having a writing tracker is so important, is to remind ourselves of the progress that we are making. You can also sometimes just drown out imposter syndrome through action and continuing to push through and show up for your writing. Sometimes we might also start to feel overwhelmed by the scope of our stories, or feeling like we have more ideas than we can put on paper. And when that starts to happen, it's important to remind ourselves of what we're trying to write and why. Why is this the story you want to tell? What is it that you can include in the next scene or chapter that would help start to rein in some of those ideas? Maybe you just need to add some of these ideas to your story idea document or your brain dump document, just so that it's down on paper, so that then you can start to quiet some of those voices and just focus on your writing. We talked a little bit about how to avoid distraction in episode 2 in this series, but what matters the most to get through the middle of writing your book is to continue showing up and to continue working on building your discipline, because as you reach the middle of your story, inspiration will unfortunately probably be showing up for you less, but don't worry, that inspiration will come back when you get towards the end of the book, because when you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, it feels like things pick up again and you are just racing towards the end. One last tip for this video is to write for a couple of minutes in the morning, whether that's 15 minutes or like an hour if somehow you can swing that in your life. But before you go to bed, assuming you're writing on your computer, you can open up your documents before you close your computer for the evening, so that when you open your computer, you eliminate the steps to start writing. Because your document's already open, there are fewer things that can get in your way before you start writing, so that you can start writing before you fully wake up, which often help you get ahead of some of your inhibitions about writing that day. And then once you have a jump start on your writing, whether it's a couple sentences or even a page or two, you have jump started your writing for the day, so that now when you go for your coffee or your breakfast or work, your brain is still sort of picking away at your story ideas in the background, so that if you have time or have scheduled time to sit down and write later on in the day, that you can feel like you've accomplished even more that day. Whenever I do that, I just feel like I give myself like a huge jump start, and I feel like I can always write write so much more on those days because I start so early. In the next episode of this series, we're going to be talking about how to write a satisfying ending for your book. But that brings us to the end of episode 3. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe if you have not already. Let me know down in the comments below what the most helpful part of this video was for you, or if you have any tips on getting through the middle that you want to share with others. Remember that progress is progress. Writing a book is an incredible thing. I'm sure you're doing an amazing job, and I believe in you. Please believe in yourself. You got this. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Sara Lubratt, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.